Good evening, Rotarians, and all of the colleagues in peace. I'm Jim Alderman, the chair of the District 5450 Peace Committee, who sponsors the forum discussion. With an extremely busy schedule, we are very fortunate to have as our presenter an individual whom I sincerely believe to be the greatest contributor for peace efforts alive today. His extensive writings, lectures, teachings have influenced throughout the world. He teaches world leaders, but yet he is such a humanist. I love the quote that he gave a while back. A lot of isolation is a degree to which people feel invisible. So when you come and show up and have concern and conversation from their location, you're rehumanizing the situation that has lost connection at a very deep level. In his full bio, listings of writings, lectures, and awards is a full 15 pages. So I assume you've all read his short bio. So as not to lose any more time, John Paul, the screen now is yours.
Well, thank you, Jim, and greetings to all of you. At least where I'm located, it's evening. I'm not sure if there are folks coming in from other parts of the world that would be morning time. I'm talking to you from south of Los Angeles, so we're close, as several of you noted, to the smokes right now and the fires that are burning around us. So we're fortunate not to be in the direct line of what's happening right now. It sort of feels a bit metaphoric at the start of 25 that this is one of the extraordinary events that we're facing. Well, there's a lot of parts of the world that feel like they're burning right now. And I think that's a big part of our challenge. I thought that what I would do this evening in the hour that we have is to share a few thoughts. I told Jim it's kind of a good opportunity for me just to reflect on something that I have not written up in exactly this form before, so it's kind of the beginning of a way of giving reflection to 4+ decades of work in this area of peace building. I started in the late 70s and formally in the field of peace studies and began more active practitioner work in the 1980s. It's getting ever closer to a half century, which is a lot of gray hair, I suppose. But one of the things I wanted to reflect on, so what I thought I would do is three pieces for this evening, and I'll try to keep them short and succinct enough that it permits us to come back to your observations and your questions and ideas that can contribute to this. But what I thought I would do is to start with a short reflection on what I've seen changing in my area of work from the 1980s, especially as we moved into the late 1980s, to today when we're moving in the 1920s into the late 1920s. Now, I should say 2020s. I'm often caught by the fact that when I was studying, we often looked back to the world wars that were in the late teens and early 20s, and then again in the 40s, which the people that I grew up with were the marking events for so many of their lives, and actually the inception, the seeding, formally, of the beginning of the field of peace studies, which came out of that time period now a century ago. So I want to start with some changes that I'm noticing, and then I want to look at some of the bigger trends that are happening globally, which I think is useful to do at the beginning of a year, and the beginning of a year that marks a quarter century. So what do we seem to be looking at that's emergent as we navigate into this new century? And then I would like to come back and give just a few thoughts on things that I have been particularly struck by that I think are useful to give deeper attention to and to really appreciate for around the world where people are engaged in against the odds in really pushing back against the trends that tend to dehumanize and often are highly militarized and that lead to long-standing and very difficult protracted conflicts. So my first observations, late 80s to the period of time that we're in now, 40 years later. I would see three things that I think are particularly notable to me. You may recall that the collapse of the Berlin Wall was in 1989, late 1980s, and there was a period leading up to that that began to end what was known as the Cold War period. Much of the work that I was engaged in over the decades has been not always easy to find what language to describe the armed conflicts that we've worked with. But there was a shift from conflicts that were highly militarized in the period of the middle of the last century to that time period that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the language that we began to land on was that many of the conflicts were described as internal but internationalized. And that was a language to try to seek a way to not call everything a civil war, because they weren't all civil wars in the classic definition. But many of the conflicts that were militarized and highly volatile took place within the boundaries of a given nation. People contesting by one way or another political power, but also contesting what they felt to be historic trends of exclusion, whether those were driven by identities of ethnicity or language or a particular geography within a country. So they were internal, but they were internationalized in that the flow of groups, weapons, ideas were often coming from contiguous bordering areas, if not internationally. Particularly, a lot of international weapons tended to flow to these hot spots. So many of the places I worked were exemplar of this. Nicaragua, Colombia, Nepal. You could go through a longer list, certainly in Africa, across West Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia. These would all be places where within a given nation state, there were wars evolving between groups contesting them, but highly internationalized. The last few years, I think we're seeing a shift in this trend, and I think it's a very disconcerting one in a lot of ways. We're seeing a much sharper rise of properly defined international militarized conflict. That is, conflict between nations across borders. The ones that jump out, of course, are obvious to many of us because they're in our daily news, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, in the Middle East. Certainly, we're looking at Israel, Palestine, but and Gaza in particular is of obvious note. But we also see that regionalization out across the whole of the region, which has a much more of an international component to it. That trend is disconcerting because the internal conflicts have not gone away. They still remain very powerful and very devastating. I've worked a lot with youth movements in South Sudan, but South Sudan, the Sudans themselves remain one of the most challenging places that we see a lot of this kind of conflict. We see an increased level of this happening in different parts of Africa as there is a kind of a pull toward more authoritarian, a return of these very powerful military actors. So that's one that I think will beg us to come back to the question of how do we approach what seems to be emergent. The second thing I'm noticing is, and I'm not quite sure how to fully name this, but it is that in that period of the late 1980s and through the 90s and into the early 2000s, I think the approach and understanding of working toward lasting peace or peace building required a broadening of the diplomatic model to be far more inclusive, a wide array of actors. And that the narrow application of diplomacy, which is based in state-to-state actors, was not sufficient for dealing with internal groups that didn't have, clear forms of representation that you could easily go to. So what the trend that we saw, I think, was a widening understanding that we needed to have a more varied, inclusive, and innovative approaches to diplomacy than those that were exclusively defined by sort of state-to-state actors. What I'm seeing now is two trends that I'm concerned about in both directions. One is that it seems like diplomacy is having a harder and harder time gaining its feet. Very difficult these days, and a narrowing rather than a broadening. The narrowing seems to be such an because of the devastation of things that are happening and the volatility of the internationalized conflicts. Um, Almost everything seems to move back toward a narrow view of achieving a ceasefire, but not asking the big questions of what are the deeper issues and the wider trends that have to be dealt with. And because diplomacy is simply not in a place it's being tasked with that. It's being asked to try to do something in the very short term. And I think a lot of people are frustrated with that narrowing in some ways, but it is a deep demand on the structures of what have historically been diplomacy. And that gets coupled with it being placed in a second order priority. That is, the people are starting to I think nations are beginning to deprioritize, and they're reprioritizing in significant ways militarized security. And so we're seeing an ever increasing level, I think, of acceptance that we're moving not toward understandings of how we demilitarize situations, but the need that security requires of us to militarize, and that's I find it a deeply concerning pattern. That's a shift from late 1980s to mid 1920 to mid 2020s where we sit now. The third thing that I would mention, and this will take me then to the discussion of some of the bigger trends, is that we have increasingly highly significant planetary challenges, challenges that involve our entire planet. But we have very little notion of a planetary family. We have this notion of sort of narrowed identities to nation states on one hand, but even more localized in a lot of cases. So while we're having planetary crises, particularly around climate and migration are two that I would mention very significant ways, our politics seems to be moving away from that complexity toward doing whatever's needed to control things locally. A kind of a more narrow view of localization, a pullback to kind of national control. Those were not the trends that we would have seen in the 90s, when there was emergent of a variety of ways that people were beginning to ask questions of how do we broaden the scope. Europe without borders. There were a whole range of things that we saw in that time period that was being talked about. The African Union's birth. There are a whole range of things that began to look at these things that had a notion of that many of our challenges required something beyond the nation state. Many of those that were imagined and began and were built upon are themselves finding a significant level of fragility and pushback with these wider trends. So let me go to the trends that I'm seeing currently that I think are some of the realities that are very difficult that we're facing. The first is that our climate and global warming, which I would put in the form of human-produced toxicity, that is, that the ways in which our human community has left in the environment, either soil, water, or air, the toxins that create the pollutants that actually affect everything that we're dealing with at a planetary level, these have created now levels of crisis that are repeating more rapidly and more significantly than we have seen at any time before in history. I don't think there's any, I know there's a lot of debate around this politically, but I think it is a reality that cannot be run from. Just a recent book that we've produced that I helped to co-edit took the title of Environmental Violence as a way to focus in on this. And one of the things that we were trying to do was to understand the myriad ways, the many ways that these catastrophes are actually contributing to the taking of human life. And if you want to get a sense of it, among the statistics that we are able now to understand, um, there are 50 times more casualties across our globe from environmental pollutants than from active warfare. 50 times more. So humanly produced toxin casualties in the year 2023 was above 9 million. War produced casualties, that is, deaths from active warfare in whatever form it took, was still under 200,000 in 23. It's now going to climb above that, I think. But still, if you look at the difference between 9 million and 200,000, you get some sense of how significant the planetary challenge of climate is on the actual well-being and the casualties that are produced by it. Not to mention that this moves us very quickly to the question of migration, of why people are fleeing. So that in our current circumstances, we have, I think, year 2024, 122 million people who were forcibly displaced from their homes due to combinations of human conflict and human-produced catastrophe and or natural disasters. And that number translates to just under 50 million refugees. So we have millions of people moving across borders and within borders, which is, part of this bigger equation of how those crises, I think, are really significant. For me personally, this was especially challenging, and the reason behind the environmental violence topic to lift it forward is that we have expended almost all of our energy in the peace studies field on the issue of armed conflict. That is, how do we deal with conflicts in better ways, and especially those that become militarized. But we have not expended an equal investment into the ways that we have been impacted by climate. And to the degree that in our professional journals, there is a dearth of people investigating this. Yet we know for a fact that the wars that are taking place, you could go now, there are websites and research initiatives and institutes that are now beginning to take this up far more seriously, that the impact of the war, say in Gaza, the impact of the war in Ukraine, will have a number of people that you can count who have been casualties of direct violence. But there will be a climatic, that is a climate-related impact that is longer lasting and far deeper in its reach than can be possibly imagined, both in terms of what happens to the soils, to the water, and to the air by the use of militarized conflict in these settings, not to mention the risks that are ever present in places in particular like Ukraine, where nuclear facilities are under potential collapse or demise in one form or another. So for me, this is one of the challenges that we really have, is how do we look at the trends that are this century, no longer on the horizon, but already immediately among us. This is no longer a question of what's coming. It's a question of what's here. The second element of this that I think is a trend or a reality that we're dealing with, I captured a bit in that phrase, that our forms of governance have mostly focused on ways that we take care, in principle, of people who live, quotes, within nations, and that we have ways that we try to build the bodies of coordination across nations. But the realities have been increasingly that our abilities to coordinate have been proven to be slow and weak, that they are not always equally responsive. We seem to be better at responding to the suffering that comes after a crisis than we are in coordinating our ability to develop mechanisms that slow or mitigate those prior to them becoming so outrageously harmful. So one of the challenges that we have is that while we have increasing planetary challenges, we don't have planetary coordination in the same way. And that, and of course, it begs all kinds of questions about what the nature of that should look like and how it should be improved and where do we find it, et cetera. But that certainly is a massively big trend. Now, we couple that governance question with what obviously appear to be the trend of the last 5 years, perhaps decade, that increasingly is gaining momentum. And that is a shift toward more autocratic and authoritarian regimes, a shift to more internal control, a shift against the expression of wider social movements in a lot of ways, and that these seem to be part of that ways, those tendencies of wanting to have access to resources and control them within a particular place that you live. But it is hardly a recipe for imagining that our greatest challenges lie beyond the nation state in a lot of ways. And that but it is one of the core ways that the response mechanisms seem to go. This is, I would say, in certain regions of the world, and Latin America is one place I've worked a lot, so I'll just mention that one in particular, an increased level of absolutely extraordinarily effective international criminalized gangs and networks of illicit trade and functioning in ways that they actually replace local and up to regional governance in a lot of the ways that they move and coordinate. And that this seems to be another part of that equation. Colombia is a country very dear to my heart, and I've worked very closely for years in the peace agreement that finally came between FARC and the Colombian government. And among the things that were understood in that whole process were ways in which there would be a demilitarization of the armed groups that were a part of, say, a movement like the longest standing guerrilla movement in the Western Hemisphere. What was not fully contemplated is that security moved pretty rapidly into these gang-based elements that began to occupy the vacuum that was created between places where government was incapable of being equally present and where there no longer were armed, formally ideologically based armed movements. And it is now a much more chaotic situation in a lot of ways that many localities across the country are facing, and that do not appear to lend themselves easily to our traditional models of negotiation, because they are quite different in their makeup and in the ways that they may function. And the third trend that I would say that I think we're seeing on the rise is that we have never fully abated, and it seems to be getting even more a much stronger investment into militarization. And this only seems to increase as the places around the world that are facing international conflicts, like probably the most extraordinary examples are the two that I gave, Russia, Ukraine, and Israel within its reach within the Middle East, particularly with the Palestinians in Gaza. The amount of weapons that are justified to be transferred and sent. We hear an enormous amount of effort focused on finding some way to create a ceasefire and the beginnings of an ending of the conflict. We hear very little active, I think, except outside of certain activist movements. We hear very little of the notion that we need to look far more carefully at ceasing the transfer, both within regions and across the global borders that we have of weapons. And we hear even less, much less, I think, than we should, about cease production. that really we have become addicted to the production of weapons as tied to security, when in fact, most of our insecurity comes from the inability to actually control the ways that these things have evolved and are being used. And the last big frontier in that, of course, is the weaponization of space, which, so I know this paints a pretty nasty little picture. But these, I think, are the trends that we're seeing. Now, I would actually make the case that I think among the biggest challenges we have are at the places where those three big trends I mentioned, climate, governance, and militarization, where each of those, if you see them kind of as bubbles, where each of those meet together, they create where some of our biggest crisis points are. So, for example, where climate and weak governance meets, we have a migration challenge beyond comprehension. Where really are people to go? And can you stop the feet from trying to flee from harm and to find some basic modicum of sanity? But we have just an extraordinary incapacity to imagine ways to deal with the planetary challenge of migration and climate. And I think it will only increase. The nexus between governance and militarization, I think the challenge there is how really do we transform the rise of these now multiple forms of war that are unfolding, the criminalization that has become highly sophisticatedly militarized, and the ability to imagine that our global health actually depends upon not relying so heavily on that militarization. And yet that nexus is one that's probably there is in my field a radical defunding of peace building right now as we speak. And it is being reinvested into forms of, if you will, engagement around security-based approaches to the militarization that people are seeing. So that at the same time that we most need it, we're not investing in the very things that may be most useful for us to think about. And the third nexus is, I think, how exactly we work with this challenge of the trend toward away from coordination to local control, with the planetary challenges that we have, in which the biggest issue is how really do we find better ways of coordinating the kind of ways in which a much wider set of people has to be involved with attending to these things that are affecting each and every one of us where we live, but to a large degree, our governance models are moving away from that responsibility. That's my view of it. Now, there may be folks out here that can put forward a different view. Now, what's the good news? So the good news that I think has been present with us for some time is that wherever these things are actually happening, people have been extraordinarily innovative. And that while there is a tendency towards the historic models of diplomacy to move away from broadening and toward narrowing, that's at least one way that I see it, I think there is an increased understanding that longer lasting solutions to really protracted conflict come when people who are proximate to those are really given a platform and a voice to engage creatively in the very places that they live. And that this is equally true with facing the climate crisis. That there is no one recipe for the climate issue that miraculously can be laid across the whole that will take care of it. It is about how different parts of the world engage with the realities that they face with their soils, waters, and air, and that they often are at the front end of innovating approaches and engaging in ways that are quite useful and clear, but are also innovative. They open up new ways of working with it. Now, in my recent writing, I've tried to bring forward some of this. There'll be a few places you can find it. I have been concerned about here. So I'm speaking from the United States. I don't know where everyone is located across this map of Zoom here that we have, but I think I've been getting a lot of questions of people asking me about the potential of an armed conflict here at home, a civil war. Is this something that we see coming? I imagine those of you reading and watching have been seeing that authors have been writing about this in a variety of ways. I picked up a response to this through a tiny little book. Jim says that I write small books, so this is a small one. It's also for free, by the way. If you want it for free, you can get it off of my website by a simple download. If you want to purchase it, you're welcome to do so. A hard copy can be sent to you, but I think it'd probably be easier just to click a button and read it if you think it's of all interest. And I called it the Pocket Guide for Facing Down a Civil War. Surprising things that people did in everyday settings that shifted cycles of violence. And I think this is precisely some of the direction we need to go. We need to realize that while the challenges are big, the people who have been most innovative are often people who have started locally and pushed back where they live. People understand what it is that's going on in places where they live, and where they really innovate around that. Those people that I would refer to as proximate actors, where we give voice and support to a lot of that, ideas emerge that I think are well worth it. So what are some of the ideas? One of the ideas that I've come to really appreciate is the aspect of our work, that my work in peace building, that has mostly been underattended to. We do a lot of work around what I would call convening. We convene dialogues, we convene negotiations, we focus on facilitation, on mediation, on the ways in which you bring actors together to talk. All of it good, all of it brilliant. I still believe in all of it. I'm not saying that isn't significant or important. But behind convening, I've found that people that create really impactful and lasting approaches do something that I would refer to as circulating. Circulating, and there would be concrete examples in this little book. I take some time to describe a few of those, one in Nepal in particular that worked on natural resource conflicts. So one of the places where climate and armed conflict meet, this is where they're engaged. And what circulation as an understanding suggests is that when even a small group, but a mixed group, that is people from different viewpoints, understandings, and even different sides of an existing conflict, move around the setting and the landscape physically. That is, that they travel to spend time in the localities that they're wanting to engage, and then come back and over again in the conversations they have. Something extraordinary happens, which is that relationships are beginning to be built, but ideas and proposals are dropped and picked up, dropped and picked up, and dropped and picked up. In other words, in the circulating, you can actually stitch conversations across a wider geography and a wider set of people than can easily happen in a convening where you rely on some form of representation. And representation happens to be the fragility of the negotiation model. Who speaks for whom and how much is always our massive challenge. Circulating, on the other hand, in the forms that I've seen it, and it takes a lot of different forms, is this ability to go and spend time looking at the world from where people live. I would make a case, it's one of the arguments I would make for here in the US that we've not had enough of, that we have relied too much on assuming that people who are speaking for other people is sufficient. And we've created massive gaps of really feeling and seeing the world from different parts of who we are as a country. That form of circulation creates something that I think has been missing, which is what I call a collective empathy. Um, Individuated empathy, we know maybe a little more about. It's the idea that I can walk a mile in the shoes of another. It's kind of like I hear your story and I can see why you feel that. Collective empathy has something to do with the ability to understand how a particular place and people from that place and the differences that may exist in that place came to be and how the world feels and looks from where they live. But it also has within that collective empathy an ability to locate things that people think might make a difference. And it is often these things that have proven to be the missing pieces in why good change doesn't last. Good change is in the form of good ideas taking hold and being able to gain a grounding and a rooting. Now, I'm increasingly finding this to be the case both in conflict work and in environmental challenges. We rely a little too much, I think, on one formula fits all, and that's not what we're going to need. We're going to need a lot of ways that people are coming at the things that are being done. So I would put forward that I have found it extraordinary that some of the most innovative models did not actually need a formal table negotiation to reach ways in which a wider set of people can cohere around collective sense making. I will say that I was inspired by entomologists, people that study insects, and to discover that one of the questions that they asked in the 1940s may be the question that we need to ask in the 2020s. And their question was, how do whole collectives cohere around common purpose or achieve common purpose without centralized control? I'll repeat the question they asked in the 1940s. How do whole collectives achieve common purpose without centralized control? Now, that was something that was being applied to bees, ants, termites. You could name a variety of insect communities. And that was the question in entomology. I find it a riveting question because I think one of the challenges we have is that I don't think centralized control is going to work. And I think we're going to have to cohere around shared purpose. So how and by what mechanisms will we find ways to do that? That is actually where the notion of circulation emerged, and it was called in entomology, it was called stigmergy, which is kind of a weird word. Stigmergy, stigma, as you know, is a mark or a sign. So it was that a scent was left in the landscape around which others could learn and build. And so the circulating around creates the ability of the collectives to share and engage, which suggests that we come to our second innovation. We have this great challenge of social media, great challenge of an information age that's moving at an extraordinarily fast pace, and which holds both great promise and great peril. And how will we triangulate what we have before us is one of the biggest challenges we have. And my sense is that it cannot be done disembodied, that we need forms by which we actually continue to have human connection that permits us to triangulate the sense making that we will need, but that we're going to have to innovate ways that happens. And I believe the best pilot for doing it is where we live. That if people circulated more actively in the communities where they lived, and then sought ways to connect at a wider level with other communities, this could actually begin to bring forward real possibilities. So why am I saying this on this Zoom call? Because this actually is what Rotarians do. I don't know if you've noticed that this may have an element of the Rotary embedded in it. And I don't know if all of you are Rotary connected, but it does have this extraordinary thing that combines three elements. The one element is that people are where they live, they begin to connect and they're circulating. They gather, so they do convene, but they also network. And I think that increasingly what I found is that unfortunately, these are the very principles that are often used in the illicit crime. Extraordinary ability to circulate, to network, but for purposes that are not for the common good. We have not been as great at doing that. And I think it's one of the things that I found over and again in local communities that have actually shifted cycles of violence. What they've shifted is the quality of their relationships across the deep divisions that may exist where they live. And to the degree we can understand that change and social change is actually relationship centric, it becomes significant how we will continue to imagine the ways that we build on relationships of the improbable, the unusual connections that come from stitching conversations in places where we have to move across the bubbles of comfort that we tend to live in when we only talk and work with people who think and are like us. So, and I could go into some stories about that, but those would be if I had two or three things to suggest, one is we need to start where we live. The second is we need to do it in improbable ways, moving across sets of people that permit us to connect with those who are different, but to not be fearful of the disagreement and the difference that may emerge, but rather to be appreciative that that difference contributes to the complexity of who we are. And the third is we should never stop imagining ways that we connect forms of networking as the ways that things actually get done, and not create structures that somehow we view as taking care of everything that we will need. We have to increase our participation and engagement in a much wider way than we have done so in the past. But I think it has to be rooted. It has to be grounded. I'm going to stop there because I know that our time is a bit short this evening, and you may want to ask questions, or you may want something more specific as examples, but I obviously would be very interested in hearing your ideas and whether any of some of these trends and challenges resonate and the things that you found particularly useful in what you're doing. So I'll stop there, Jim, and turn it back to you. I'm happy to take a few comments or questions as you see fit.
You are muted, Jim.
Oh, I apologize. Anyway, thank you, John Paul, very, very much. There will be many questions, and since we have multiple screens, I cannot see your hand, so please use the virtual hand, which you will find in reactions at the bottom of your screen. We do have a couple, and Quantadon, I believe you had the first hand up.
Thank you. I wanted to address three areas. Perhaps you can help us, elaborate about what you have said about the relationships that we build with different people. I have been involved in the peace movement and environmental movement for 40 years, and it has experience that the people who are promoting peace and environmental education are mostly white and affluent people. And when people from different areas of society come to them, they see it as an intrusion, and they are very intolerant of this. I wanted to bring that. That's an issue. But what I wanted to also address is that there is, in your opinion, and I totally do agree with you, greater emphasis on peace education, because I researched and there's $20 billion in the peace movement, yet there is no peace. I think the reason is that war receives immediate attention, mental and emotional attention, and it creates acute conditions, whereas environmental problems are caused by chronic materialism, and it is insidious and it has been installed subliminally. So, what can we do to help people understand that actually, both what I mentioned the first time, that we do not have unity of humanity? So that's one thing. And the people who are promoting peace and environmental education are mostly affluent white intellectuals in the Western society. So, what can we do to come together and to listen to everybody and understand that everyone's participation has a value rather than otherizing one another? So, but this materialism, this chronic materialism, it really is the cause of wars, it's cause of environmental destruction, and many, many problems. And now we have exported this to Asia, Africa, and because they are looking at the Western world, and to be wealthy means to have excessive materialism. So how can we deal with that problem? Thank you very much.
John, you're muted.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure, Jim, if you wanted to take several or just go one by one.
One by one.
Okay. No, I appreciate, I couldn't quite tell, was that Quanta that was speaking?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. So let me just say that I didn't go to the examples, but all of the examples that well, 90% of the examples that I gave in the pocket guide for facing down a civil war came from communities around the world who are the inverse of white and affluent. The women of Wajir in the border area between Kenya and Somalia, the southern region of Nepal, the Tarai region, where the initiation of the natural resource conflict transformation movement began. The campesinos in Medio Magdalena in Colombia that were the first people to ever successfully negotiate a peace zone, and who had an extraordinary phrase that they used, which was that we will seek to understand those who do not understand us. The improbable dialogues in the northwestern region on the Venezuelan border of Colombia and Venezuela. These were locations where what I found was that while there is a dominance in the formal literature and a dominance in the global movements of white and affluent, the dominance of innovation is coming from other places. And it's coming from places where people have a long history where they live, have experienced decades of often very violent conflict, and have found extraordinary ways to respond. So let me take the example of the women of Wajir. They simply began with a cross-clan group. So I'm going to come back to try to emphasize my couple of points that I made earlier. Faced with decades of open clan, sub-clan militia groups in their region, pouring over from the Somali region into Kenya, 4 or 5 women found a way to actually stop a war in their region. And the way that they began that was that across their sub-clans, they sat together to ask the question, how would they create the potential for a market that would be safe to buy and sell in for anyone from any sub-clan? So cross-clan, mixed beyond their bubbles, local, finding something concrete that was worth focusing on. Third, innovating the ways that they would do it. They began very small, but that thing grew. And one of the reasons it grew was that point that I made about networking is they never stopped imagining who the next level of participation needed to be until they reached all the way into the policing and the parliament and beyond into the border areas of the business community. Now, in their small example, which I describe in a little more detail in a couple of the books that I've written, and these are women that I have worked with very closely for quite a number of years to try to understand better who they were and how they operated. I think that the real innovation that they had so much to do with the belief that they were capable of responding differently in their particular situation, but that it was going to require an imagination that the well-being of the grandchildren of the people I perceive to be my enemy is actually connected to the well-being of my grandchildren. So our grandchildren are going to live with the choices that we're making now. And that imagination was actually that, I think one way to describe it is that you imagine yourself connected to a web of relationships that includes your enemy as the mode, as the vehicle, as the seed pod for the kind of change that will be required. Because there is no place we can go that will protect the well-being of our children unless other children's well-being is also protected. This is exactly what I found in Mindanao in the middle of the war. Muslim and Catholic communities who at a local level said the same thing. We can't focus on a ceasefire to end the war. We can focus on how we together will work to make this road safe for our children to walk to school. So finding something that is accessible, principle number one, it's often local. Finding people who are unexpectedly different, but who can come together, and you don't need many. In fact, I refer to it as the critical yeast instead of the critical mass. What you need is the few who will make other things grow, and sticking with it over time, because it is a relationship question, not a policy question initially, on which the actual capacity of change to happen emerges. And this is what, across those examples I just gave, I've found over and again. So I agree with you, Quanta, that we have suffered too much from white affluent and extraordinary levels of materialism that rarely attend to the deepest of the human needs. I also think that the most extraordinary examples are coming from people who are very proximate to the situations where they're finding responses to what they're doing. And that in itself is the seed that we need to carry. That it's not about offering somebody something far away of what should be done. It's about the hard work of how we will engage the things that are most needed where we live, and that if we can do that well and well connected, we begin to circulate a range of things that have an ability to push back on violence as the only option that appears viable. And that's been pretty much my life work. I think it was Bettelheim that said violence is the option of a person who can imagine no other alternative. And I think the work that we have before us is not to judge people who take up violence, but to seek the alternatives that make violence unimaginable. And I don't think we do that massively. We have to do it in small pilots first to understand how it works and how it engages. And those have to be connected over time. And I just simply am finding that there are far more resourceful people who have experienced this across decades that can inform us, who are actually the ones that may appear wealthy, but we have a dearth of what matters most. And that's part of the thing that I'm trying to bring forward that I think holds promise.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And I believe Richard Denton has the next question.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for your excellent presentation. You've sort of talked about it just now, but in your initial discussion, you did not mention women and youth. And I see that they are, I think, the promise to creating long-lived peace solutions for the women, because I feel that they often look more at the root causes. The second is to comment about youth, which I think are preeminent in the environmental area, working for the fossil fuel prevention or prohibition treaty and Fridays for the Future and that sort of thing, while we gray-haired white people have developed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But we need to bring these two groups together, and I would appreciate your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Richard. 100% agree. Obviously, when I went to my examples, I stated it much clearer. I think the things that we need to tie into are that youth in settings of war are often the fodder that's chosen to fight those. It's been true historically, and it remains one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle. But they are the least involved in any form of the actual peace building or formal negotiations. The inverse would probably be true. So any location that you're at, you should imagine the rough statistics of older folks to youth in your communities or organizations or otherwise. And quite typically, like South Sudan, I think I work for a foundation, our whole initiative there was to ask the question, how do we bolster the rise of a younger generation of leaders? So we've invested exclusively in a mixed youth movement of men and women who are all under the ages of 30, 35. And with the idea that so much of this work is generational, but we don't invest in generational ways. Women the same. I think women are at the absolute fore of so much of what makes sense for changes that have to happen. And if you look statistically at going back again to the tension that exists between where innovation is happening and what makes it last on the ground, and compared with who's present at formal first track governmental negotiations, typically it's less than 5% in any given year of women who participate in negotiation tables. Yet if you look at anything that is about lasting and innovation on the ground, the exact inverse is almost true. It's like 95% of women are often at the fore of where it begins and how it's held to over time. So we have a lot of work to do. I think that there is nothing short of the need to follow exactly what you're suggesting, that at the fore of a lot of this work, we have to have far more recognition of leadership and example from women and youth than is typically done in many of the ways that we do our formal and particularly governmental work, which have the percentages almost in inverted form. And that's, I think, sits at the very heart of much of this. So appreciate it. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. And David, do you still have a question? David Cheesley? And if not, David, we will go to Paxton.
Yeah, I do, but I see we're short on time, and I'll pass.
David, what was your question?
Well, Probably the main thing would be the further discussion of peace in outer space. I noticed that John Paul had mentioned that
Yeah.
earlier, and it's something that I'm interested in, and have been in contact, in fact, with Space Force in an interest of bringing them into Rotary and having a discussion about what they're doing.
Well, I think it's a brilliant, I think we are sitting at the precipice of what direction of much of that will go, because in the coming, well, the remainder of this century, I would well imagine that space capacity and exploration is going to ratchet up enormously. We're seeing that both from private investment and potentially, and certainly governmental investment across the world. Very little effectively has been put in place to not permit that to become yet the newest source of conflict and militarization. In fact, the inverse, I think, is emergent. So I think the kind of thing that you're asking is exactly what would be useful for Rotary to do globally. Not ask what is our country doing to protect ourselves from that, but asking what are we doing to prevent it from becoming a frontier of new wars. Now, there are people and institutes that have been engaged in this. There's one, in fact, in Boulder, Colorado, where some of you are at. That has engaged on some of the both research and conversations around this. But it is a woefully underattended to topic, and it's moving very fast. And I think anything we know about the innovation of technology is that there are periods where it's like that famous hockey stick. It kind of can go slow for a while, and then it begins to catch. And once it catches, it can go very, very fast. And that we may be on the precipice of something there that is going to move much more rapidly in the coming decades. And I think it would be absolutely incumbent upon us not to transport our wars to space, or to transport control of our wars from space, which is increasingly and obviously the case. So it's a big area. I'm not a specialist in it, but it is one that I see as one of the biggest that's on the horizon.
I agree.
Marcel and Cinda, and for those of you in Boulder, I think you know them. Cinda, I know, is a Rotarian. Have invested a good bit in early conversations on this. If you wanted to follow it up.
Name again?
Marcel and Cinda Arsenault.
Okay.
One Earth is their formal foundation. They have a second one now, I think.
Thank you.
We have two more quick questions, and in lieu of time, if we can be succinct, Elaine Pratley has been trying to get on. Elaine, do you have a question?
Hi, I was just curious for tips or language on how to sell everyday peace building to organizations who want demonstrated return on investment, elite.
Paxton, I think I got most of that question. It kind of dropped off toward the end.
Looks like someone might be turning my audio off. I was just curious for language or tips on how to sell everyday peace building to organizations that might prioritize liberal peace building, elite leadership, or wanting a clear return on investment in their peace building, as opposed to recognizing that local peace building is slow, it's relational, it's very hard to show that demonstrated return on investment quickly. So just curious about how we might show the value of everyday peace building to people who look for formal governance structures and formal peace building.
Well, it's a great question, and language is always complicated, and it's certainly further complicated by the need for quick turnaround results and return on investment as the criteria. I think research has increasingly borne out that the ability for something to last that requires the kind of changes that are needed in shifting the patterns of deep conflict will require an increased level of participation. That you can't have, it's not something that can be transplanted, and it's not something that can be done for people without them having a sense of connection and voice and participation. Now, whether there's an everyday language for that, it's always hard to know. I certainly think that some investors want quick returns. If they take the time to look back across decades, they will see that their quick returns never fully panned out and that they were reinvesting in the same thing over and over again. So a longitudinal way of looking at it, I sometimes say I think it takes about as long to get out of a conflict as it took to create it. That's not always, that doesn't make people very happy, but I think there's a great deal of truth to it. How we invested in and how deeply our divisions run is not something that turns around overnight. I think the second, for particularly if you're looking for people that have questions about effectiveness, I think effectiveness is not whether a result will happen next year, but whether a process will endure, and whether that process has a capacity to generate creatively new challenges that it will face. So for if it's a company that is looking at its durability, it's not just looking at how am I going to sell this product this year. It's asking what's the evolution of what we need to be involved with, and how do we understand the communities that we're serving, and what meets the needs that has an enduring quality. There are a lot of ways that even the business community imagines how they situate their responses to the places that they're in. I do think that one of the things that's kind of paradoxical is that sometimes the word peace is not the best one to use. That it may have much more to do with asking questions about improving the quality of life in a location, about improving people's sense of well-being. There are a lot of ways that you could come at talking about the things that are needed that would not have to fall into what might be an ideologically loaded term, depending on who you're speaking with. So it's a great question. It's a hard one to answer because I would have to know with whom are we talking and in what context, in order to think creatively about the ways that a kind of collective sense making can be brought forward that is useful for that particular
Perhaps
moment.
given the context about us reaching out to Rotarians and our Rotary clubs.
Yeah. Well, my sense is that so much of this ties to the core of the Rotarian values. To, an ability to be in conversation that's honest, an ability to have trustworthy people and places, a concern for the well-being of the communities. These are all ways that Rotarians actually speak about it. Why do you have local clubs in a global network? I mean, your actual model is the very thing I was describing, isn't it? It's about people participating where they're located. So in Nepal, the natural resource conflict transformation movement started with some basic principles. And one of the core principles was that, so it came from the movement that was referred to as the community, forest community user groups. So a forest community user group is a group who comes together locally to protect a local forest for purposes that they have of the well-being of their wider and very diverse communities, but also protection from outside sources or misuse, all right? And those beginning points of a community forest user group, they started with like 2 or 3 principles. Principle number 1 was you have to join a local group. So the way you join is you don't join by being hired nationally to join a network. You join by being a part of a local group. The group locally has to be half men and half women. It's the only movement in all of Nepal that made a formal commitment to the equal participation of men and women from the beginning to the end. The third was that your primary responsibilities are for including people who are connected to, have access to, or need the well-being of a local forest, that whoever is in that community has to have equal access to this group. So that meant that people of lower caste identities were included equally with others within all of those forest user groups. Now those core little tiny principles, which may seem kind of foreign and far-fetched if you're not from Nepal or potentially India, to know what that might mean. They started with less than 20 people. And their movement in Nepal, the Forest User FICO Fund in particular, their movement in Nepal now has almost 1/4 of the adult population of Nepal involved in their movement. There are close to 7 to 8 million people. The conflict transformation, the Natural Resource Conflict Transformation Group emerged from that user group phenomena. And water and land and forestry in particular. And they employed the same principles. The principle of participation, the principle of access, the principle of conversations with people where they live. These all guided the ways that they began to build how they responded to what had become very large-scale and often violent conflicts over the use of natural resources. You can find their website, by the way, if you want to look at it a little more carefully. It's a rather extraordinary movement. But to go to your question, I forgot the name now, Pax, I think it was. I think the language that they engaged was that they found ways to use what made sense to people where they lived. And I think that's what the Rotarians do. You all aren't asking people to get a PhD in something or other to join the club. Yeah, it's like, what is it that makes sense to people? You've got to locate that in ways, and I think that you've got at hand in the very values that are often repeated in the meetings. You've got at hand the core principles of why much of this kind of work makes sense. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I would turn first to what makes sense as to why people are attracted to who you are before you try to convince people of something that's quite foreign to them. If that makes sense.
John Paul, we thank you so much. What an evening. We're so indeed grateful for the work that you do and the information that you bring to so many. And we thank you for taking the time in your extremely busy schedule to share your knowledge and your expertise with us. We thank you. We thank you. Before I go on, I just want to mention that next month, we're eager to hear from Lester Kurtz. Lester is the professor of public sociology at George Mason University. He teaches courses in violence and nonviolence, peace and conflict, social movements, comparative sociology of religion, and global social thought. His full bio and more will be in your email box Monday morning. John, thank you so very, very much. We are most grateful.
Thank you, and best to all of you. Happy New Year.